Hello everyone. 1 John 5:7, King James Bible. I haven't bothered to make a video on this particular verse yet because I think most people are aware that it's a scribal corruption. It's an inauthentic verse that John didn't write. However, someone asked me about it the other day, so I thought, well, I probably should make a video on it at some point. For there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Now, I've seen where some people make statements like, well, this would be a very powerful proof of the Trinity, if in fact it was authentic. I don't think that's the case, and we'll see that in a minute. One of the things about this verse is that there's a lot of disinformation being spread around about this verse. Disinformation just being a nice word for outright lies. For example, people say, well, Cyprian quoted it. Well, you go check the source, and Cyprian's not quoting this verse. Or Tertullian quoted it, and you go check the source. Tertullian didn't quote it. Or I've seen where people say, well, so-and-so quoted this verse, in early church, and then you go check, and it's a suspicious writing, a spurious writing, attributed to a certain person. And it's probably inauthentic. The whole writing is inauthentic, let alone quoting this verse. Stuff like that. There's all kinds of disinformation written about this passage. And when you start looking at it, you really start to realize how people are really, really stretching, telling outright lies, really, about this passage and who quoted it in the early church to try to, say it's authentic. The evidence against this passage is very, very strong. Very strong. And that's why you don't see it in modern translations. First of all, let's just suppose that it was authentic, just for the sake of argument. What would it prove? Would it prove the Trinity? Well, no, if you read it in context, it wouldn't really prove anything. It would basically prove the same thing as John 10:30. Similar to John 10:30. I and the Father are one. The problem here is that you get many Trinitarian folks who read into the text and they kind of forget about the context when they're doing it. So they'll read something like, for there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one God. Just fill in the blanks however you like. Or one being, or one substance. So they read into the text. But if you read the context, what John is talking about is one united testimony. The Spirit, the water, and the blood. These three are one. For there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And there are three that testify on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three are one. Well, are we to suppose the Spirit and the water and the blood are one being? You see how goofy it's going to get if you're consistent? So all John would be talking about here, if this verse were authentic, is that there would be a united testimony. The Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit would be in agreement, one united testimony, the same as the Spirit, the water, and the blood. But as it turns out, it's like 99.999999999% sure that this verse wasn't written by John. And there's a number of reasons that we can look at that tell us that. First of all, you have to understand the difference between Greek manuscripts and Latin manuscripts. And the simplest way to do that, I'm just going to kind of dumb it down into a really simple way, is to just take Europe, maybe add the Middle East in there, and then just start between Italy and Greece, and then just draw a line straight up and divide Europe into a west half and an east half. And the east side spoke Greek in church, the west side spoke Latin in church. So you had the Latin speaking and the Greek speaking. So you can imagine how the Greek half of the church never had to translate anything. They just had to make copies and copies of the Greek, because it was originally written in Greek. Where the west half had their Latin translations, the west half of the church. In the east half of the church, the Greek-speaking church, you can't find this verse. It's only found in 8 very late Greek manuscripts. And 4 of those have it written in the margin. It was added later. You can tell by looking at them. Most of these manuscripts, these late manuscripts that have the verse, are from the 16th century. And the earliest manuscript, maybe 14th, 15th century, I don't think they're sure, or 15th or 15th century, I think they think it is. It has this verse written in the margin. It's called a gloss. So there's no sure evidence that 1 John 5:7 existed in any Greek manuscript until about the 16th century. Okay, and they call this the comma. It's kind of a term used for this verse, the comma Johannium. And so you have this situation where the eastern part of the church didn't have this verse in their Bibles. Okay, and we have lots of manuscripts, early manuscripts dating back to the 4th, 5th century, and this verse isn't there. And that's very telling, because they were Trinitarians. These 4th, 5th century and up till today, or up till the 16th century, they were Trinitarians. So do you think they would let this verse sort of sneak out of all their Bibles in the eastern half of the Roman Empire? It's a ridiculous proposition. How did they let this verse get away? You know, and it's not just out of one Bible, it's out of thousands. It's a ridiculous proposition, but it's not there. The verse does not exist, but it did exist in Latin manuscripts from about the late 4th century, early 5th century, somewhere in there, we're not sure. And then you can see how it kind of creeps into, by making copies, it creeps into the western part of the church. So the eastern part of the church doesn't even have 1 John 5:7. The western part of the church does have 1 John 5:7. So it's a pretty easy conclusion to reach. Somehow it entered into the copies of the western half of the church. I mean, you just can't have a situation where, the Greek-speaking eastern half of the church just sort of let this verse sneak out of their Bibles. It's really a ridiculous proposition. It's absurd. Especially in view of the fact that they were Trinitarians. They're not going to want this verse out of their Bibles. But it's not there. And that's probably the most telling evidence that this verse is fake. It's a fake. It somehow got into these Latin manuscripts, and then it just kind of spread in the western part of the church. You know, to say nobody noticed, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, it was in the Greek-speaking Bibles in the eastern half of the church. but then it somehow disappeared. Well, how did that happen? How did that happen so consistently? All these thousands of manuscripts and Bibles they had, all of a sudden it consistently disappears out of all their Bibles. You see how that's not going to work? And that's one of the basic reasons why textual critics and scholars know there's something went wrong here. This verse was added to the Latin manuscripts. And the eastern half of the church, they wouldn't be regarding this because they never had to translate anything. They just kept making copies of their Greek manuscripts. Meanwhile, over in the western part of the church, they're making Latin copies of their Latin manuscripts. You see how something different is going on in the western part of the church. So to try to claim that this snuck out of everybody's Bibles and nobody noticed is just, it's crazy. It's a crazy thought. And we know it wasn't there, because it's not there in the early Greek manuscripts. Another thing is that when the so-called Arian controversy was going on in the 4th century, nobody mentions this verse. Now, why wouldn't anybody mention this verse? Well, maybe because it wasn't there. You see? Yet another thing is when the Arian controversy was over, that was right about the time that Augustine comes into the picture. Early in the 5th century, the early 400s, and Augustine sets out to write this huge document on the Trinity. He's going to really be the first guy who tries to explain the doctrine of the Trinity after the Arian controversy is over. This is what we believe. So Augustine's going to write about this. And it's a very large work. Never mentions this verse. Not once. And he also wrote a commentary on 1 John. Same thing, it's not there. And you should see what he does say about 1 John. When he gets to the Spirit, the water, and the blood, he tries to make the Spirit the Father, which, by the way, doesn't even work in Trinitarian doctrine. In Trinitarian doctrine, the Spirit is not the Father. He tries to make the water the Spirit, and he tries to make the blood Jesus. That's what Augustine did with 1 John 5:8, I guess it is now. The Spirit becomes the Father, the water becomes the Spirit, the blood becomes Jesus, and he tries to, sort of allegorically interpret that verse in this way. Why would he bother doing that? Because 1 John 5:7 wasn't there. He wouldn't bother doing that if 1 John 5:7 was there and he knew about it. And it's pretty absurd what he did do with the Spirit and the water and the blood, and he does the same kind of wretched things with John 17:3 and a bunch of other verses. For the sake of his tradition, the Trinity. So Augustine writes this huge work on the Trinity, the doctrine. He spent years on it. In fact, I think he lost a copy of it, or he said somebody stole it at one point. And it's a very large work, never mentions this verse. Do you think that's going to be likely? And his commentary, you think it's going to be likely that he just, overlooks this verse? It wasn't there to mention. That's why he doesn't mention it. And the interesting part about that is that Augustine was in the Latin-speaking part of the church, where the verse kind of first appears. And guess when it appears? Right around the time Augustine is writing. And so you have this, explanation that Augustine gives for 1 John 5:8. And the next thing you know, 1 John 5:7 appears, and it looks a lot like what Augustine said about 1 John 5:8. That's one possibility. That someone wrote Augustine's explanation of 1 John 5:8 in a column. Next thing you know, that becomes a verse. Some people think that's maybe what happened, but we're not entirely sure. So you got to watch out for the disinformation on this verse. You just got to think about it, look at the evidence, and it's really quite plain that there's no way John could have wrote this. The only very, very remote possibility is that the first copy that the Greek-speaking church used, if you could just hone it down to one, which I doubt you could do, somehow this verse got out of there, and then they made a bunch of copies, and a bunch more copies, and a bunch more copies, and because of that, this verse is missing. But, that's not even going to be likely, because if the Latin-speaking part of the church had this verse, I think the Greek-speaking part of the church would become aware of it and say, why is it missing? I mean, there's a 1,000-year period here, from the Arian controversy to about the 16th century, over 1,000 years, where this verse isn't there in the eastern half of the church. It's not in their Bibles. It's not there. And that's very, very, very telling. There's another twist to this verse that might be the possible source of it. There's a guy by the name of Priscillian in Spain. And his story is that he was ultimately condemned and executed for sorcery. But there's some writings of his, or we think they're his, that have a verse very similar to 1 John 5:7 in Spain, Latin-speaking part of the church. And this is about 380 AD. Now, the verse isn't exactly the same as you see in the King James version of 1 John 5:7. It's a little bit different. However, he might have been the source for this verse. And right about that time, the barbarians are coming from the north and the east into Spain. And a lot of Christians were fleeing Spain. And guess where they were going? North Africa. And North Africa is where we first see this verse appearing in Latin manuscripts. So it could very well be that, Christians taking manuscripts that were maybe doctored by Priscillian, they end up in North Africa, copies are made, and then they end up back going north into Spain and France, and they become part of the tradition of the Latin-speaking western half of Europe. I think that maybe could be what happened. I did a little research on some of the historical events surrounding all this, and there's another guy we know about who came from Spain, went to North Africa. He was associated with some key figures in the church that we know about. Augustine was in North Africa too, by the way. And so you can sort of see how it probably happened, how this verse ended up in Latin manuscripts. And I think there's a good case to be made. It probably did start in Spain, and this corruption got in there with Priscillian or some of his associates or somebody that taught him or something like that. At any rate, we know it was introduced into the Latin manuscripts, and it was never there until about the very late or early 5th century in the Latin-speaking church. It never was there in the Greek-speaking church, and it just kind of showed up in the 16th century. And the reason that would happen, that it would show up in Greek manuscripts in the 16th century, is it had a lot to do with the East and the West being able to exchange information. Before that time, it kind of wasn't possible. It had a lot to do with the Moors in Spain and the Muslims and what they had control of versus the Christians and what they had control of. And that kind of changed in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in there. It started to change. And so there was this exchange of information, and that's why it would start showing up in Greek manuscripts in the 16th century. So when you look at all the facts, you can get a pretty clear picture of why we can be sure that John didn't write this verse. And even if he did, it still wouldn't prove the Trinity. It would only prove that the Father, the Word, and the Spirit are one united witness, one testimony. Yeah, everybody agrees with that. And so really, as a Trinitarian proof text, and I notice Trinitarians still use this verse, I don't know why, it falls flat. Even if it was authentic, even if we suppose that for the sake of argument, it still doesn't show anything. And I've noticed there's kind of two different people that appeal to this passage. There's the King James only people. So of course they're going to appeal to it. But then I noticed there's another group of people that appeal to 1 John 5:7 as well as 1 Timothy 3:16. And those people are people that don't read the King James Bible. They usually read something like the NIV or something similar. Except when it comes to 1 John 5:7 and 1 Timothy 3:16, they'll just abandon their own translation and they'll appeal to the King James Version. Why? There's kind of a measure of dishonesty in that. You're just cherry picking whatever you can find to try to promote your doctrine when you do things like that. So someone asked me about this passage, so I thought, well, I'll do a video on it. I hope that was helpful to some of you, and it might clear up for some of you why we know John didn't write these words. God bless you.